What sparked the Civil War in the United States? There certainly were quite a few incidents in the years leading up to 1860 that contributed to the terrible conflict, but perhaps none was more significant than the Dred Scott decision by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1857. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University, and this is a Muscogee County School District podcast, The Dred Scott Decision. Take a careful look at this map of the United States about 1850. The states that are colored orange were states where slavery was legally in practice, and the states that are colored green are states where slavery was illegal. It probably makes sense then that the goal of a runaway slave was to make it to one of the green states, where he had the feeling that once there, he was a free man. So once a slave crossed over into a free state, he thought that he was free forever. The idea was once free, always free. Now, Dred Scott was a slave who lived in the state of Missouri, a state where slavery was legal. But his master, Dr. John Emerson, routinely took Dred with him across the Mississippi River into Illinois, a free state. Now, when they crossed over, was Dred a slave or a free man? Under the law of Illinois, no slavery was allowed. So Dred was free, right? Well, not so fast. His master took him back to Missouri. In 1843, his master died, and Dred was inherited by Dr. Emerson's wife and by her brother, John Sanford. A few years later, Dred Scott was informed by a local lawyer that when he stepped into Illinois, Dred technically became a free man, and he told him that the rule was once free, always free. So the lawyer agreed to file a case in the court on behalf of Dred so that the Sanfords would have to release him. In the meantime, Dred and his wife were taken into the supervision of the St. Louis sheriff. They were temporarily given employment, but the money that they earned was placed into a special account, and depending on how the court case was resolved, they may or may not get to keep the money that they worked for. Well, in 1850, Dred Scott won the case. But then the Sanfords quickly appealed, and Dred and his wife had to remain in St. Louis in the sheriff's custody while they awaited the outcome of the appeal. In 1852, the Missouri Supreme Court reversed the decision and told Dred that he was, in fact, still a slave. But at this point, some prominent abolitionist lawyers, some wealthy fellows, decided to come to the aid of Dred Scott and take his case into the United States federal court system. But when a federal court in 1854 agreed that Dred Scott should not be freed, his abolitionist attorneys then appealed his case all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. This is called the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. It was decided in 1857. This Supreme Court case, Scott versus Sanford, is perhaps the most famous or infamous court case in the history of the United States. The judge who wrote the decision was Chief Justice Roger Taney of Maryland. As Taney was from a slave plantation, it seemed that the deck was somewhat stacked against Dred Scott. The principal question that Taney addressed was whether or not a black person was considered a citizen according to the United States Constitution. If Dred Scott wasn't a citizen, then he had no citizen's rights, no civil rights, especially no right to take his master to court to earn his freedom. Taney and 6 other Supreme Court judges decided that the U.S. Constitution says that black people are not citizens of the United States of America.
The question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed to citizens, one of which rights is the privilege of suing in a court? We think they are not, and that they were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges. On the contrary, they were considered as a subordinate and inferior class of beings. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that Dred Scott is not a citizen.
Wow, this decision really made a lot of people take notice. Especially, however, it angered to no limit those who hated slavery, who called themselves abolitionists. And the one person perhaps most angered by this was a man living in Kansas named John Brown. Brown was fed up, and since the United States government couldn't be trusted to bring about justice, Brown determined that he'd have to take matters into his own hands and solve the problem of slavery all by himself. Our story of John Brown will be the focus of our next Muscogee County School District podcast. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University. This has been another Muscogee County School District podcast, The Dred Scott Decision.